For most of human history, there was no inside. There was no place where the body could step away from the wind, the cold, or the ground beneath it. No wall to create distance, no roof to slow down the sky. And yet, the human body learned to exist in that exposure day after day, night after night, without ever being fully protected. So what did it really mean to live in a world where nothing separated you from it? What human life was really like before you had shelter? There was no true inside. Wherever the body stopped, the world continued without interruption, pressing against the skin from every direction. The ground did not belong to anyone, the air did not hold still, and the space around the body could not be shaped or contained. Without shelter, there was no boundary that could separate a person from wind, from shifting temperature, or from the slow movement of the night. Even the idea of being somewhere had a different meaning, because a place was not defined by walls or edges, but by temporary conditions that could change at any moment. The body remained in direct contact with everything, not as an observer, but as a surface constantly receiving pressure, cold, warmth, and movement. In this condition, space was not something you entered or left, it was something you endured. A slight rise in the ground might reduce exposure in one direction. A cluster of trees might interrupt the wind for a short time, but these were not stable protections. They did not create an inside. They only altered the way the outside was felt. Over long stretches of human history, this lack of separation shaped how space was understood. There was no fixed reference point that remained the same across nights. A place that felt manageable once could feel entirely different the next time, depending on weather, light, and subtle environmental shifts. This meant that the body could not rely on location alone for stability. It had to remain responsive, constantly adjusting to conditions that never fully repeated. Even rest did not remove this connection. Lying down did not create distance from the world, but increased contact with it. The ground became part of the body's experience, transferring cold or warmth, hardness or unevenness directly into muscle and bone. There was no layer in between to soften or filter that interaction. This is where the origin of human spatial awareness begins to show its earliest form, not as control over space, but as sensitivity to it. The human body evolved within this continuous exposure, learning not to isolate itself from the environment, but to read it through constant contact. The absence of shelter did not create a dramatic moment of danger, but a steady condition where separation was never fully achieved. And within that condition, the idea of an inside had not yet been formed as something stable or reliable, only as something briefly suggested by the environment, and then lost again. Without a boundary to hold the world back, the body itself became the only place where separation could begin, but that separation was never complete. Skin did not function as a wall, only as a surface that could feel and react. It could sense cold but not stop it. It could detect pressure but not remove it. This meant that the body was not protected from the environment, but constantly negotiating with it. Each change in temperature, each movement of air, each shift in moisture passed directly into the body's awareness, shaping how it responded from moment to moment. There was no layer to delay or soften these interactions. The body received them immediately, without distance. Over long periods of human evolution, this continuous exposure did not disappear, but became the condition under which the body adapted. Heat could be generated internally, but only within limits. Cold could be endured, but not indefinitely. The absence of shelter meant that these limits were reached more often, and the body had to adjust its behavior accordingly. Movement, posture, and positioning in space became ways of managing exposure, not eliminating it. A slight turn away from the wind, a shift toward drier ground, a change in how the body rested against the surface beneath it. These small adjustments carried meaning because there was no larger structure to provide stability. This also meant that comfort was not a fixed state, but something temporary and fragile. It could appear for a short time when conditions aligned, and then disappear as those conditions changed. The body learned to recognize these brief moments, not as something to depend on, but as something to use while they lasted. In this sense, the boundary between the body and the world was always shifting. It did not hold still long enough to create a lasting separation. Even at rest, the body remained engaged, continuously responding to subtle changes in the environment. This responsiveness was not a sign of tension, but a reflection of how human physiology developed in the absence of fixed protection. The environment was not outside the experience of the body. It was part of it, entering through every point of contact. Over time, this shaped a form of awareness that did not rely on distance or enclosure, but on direct, immediate interaction with the surrounding world. And from that origin, the idea of needing shelter begins to emerge, not as an abstract concept, but as a gradual recognition of how limited the body alone could be in creating separation from what was always present. The moment the body lowered itself to rest, the ground became unavoidable. It was not a surface chosen for comfort, but the only surface available. Without shelter, there was no elevation, no separation, no material placed between the body and the earth. Every point of contact carried information directly into the body: hardness, moisture, temperature, unevenness. None of it filtered, none of it reduced. The ground did not adapt to the body. The body had to adjust to the ground. A slight change in terrain could alter how pressure was distributed across muscles and bones. A small patch of damp soil could draw heat away more quickly than expected. Stones, roots, and subtle shifts in elevation could interrupt stillness, preventing the body from settling into a single, stable position. Over time, this meant that rest was never fully detached from the environment. Even when the body became still, it remained in active contact with the surface beneath it, responding to it in small, continuous ways. This is where the absence of shelter becomes most physical, not as an abstract lack of protection, but as a constant exchange between body and ground. In early human environments, this exchange shaped how places were used. Areas that appeared only slightly different during the day, more even, less exposed, better drained, could become significantly more manageable at night. Archaeological traces of repeated occupation often reflect these subtle preferences, suggesting that early humans returned to places where the ground allowed a more stable form of rest, even if only marginally. But even in those locations, the ground never became neutral. It remained a source of pressure and temperature, influencing how long the body could remain still and how deeply it could settle. Without a layer to interrupt this contact, the body learned to distribute its weight carefully, to shift when discomfort increased, and to respond before strain became too great. These adjustments were not conscious decisions in a structured sense, but patterns that emerged through repeated exposure. The ground, in this way, was not just a place to lie down. It was an active part of the experience of being without shelter, shaping posture, limiting stillness, and influencing the rhythm of rest itself. And through this constant contact, the boundary between the body and the environment became even less defined. Not because it disappeared, but because it was never given the chance to fully form in the first place. Without a structure to interrupt it, weather was not something observed from a distance, but something that entered directly into the body's experience. Wind did not pass around a shelter, it moved across the skin. Cold did not remain outside, it settled into muscle and breath. Heat did not stay above, it pressed downward and accumulated across the surface of the body. In this condition, weather was not a background to human life, but a continuous force that shaped every moment of it. There was no stable point where its influence could be paused. A shift in air movement, a change in humidity, or a gradual drop in temperature could alter the body's state without warning. This meant that the environment was never fully still. Even in moments that appeared calm, small variations continued, and the body remained responsive to them. Over long periods of human history, this constant exposure influenced how people positioned themselves in space. Slight differences in terrain, such as a dip in the ground, a cluster of vegetation, or a natural barrier, could reduce the force of wind or the rate of heat loss. These features did not remove weather, but they changed how it was felt. Archaeological patterns suggest repeated use of such locations, indicating that early humans gravitated toward environments where these effects were slightly moderated. However, these adjustments were always partial. No place could fully separate the body from changing conditions. The absence of shelter meant that adaptation occurred through positioning rather than protection. The body learned to align itself with the environment in ways that reduced strain, even if only temporarily. From a biological perspective, this created a system where internal regulation had to respond continuously. Heat had to be conserved or released, depending on conditions. Moisture had to be managed without external control, These processes were limited in how much they could compensate, and when environmental changes exceeded those limits, the body had to adjust its behavior again. This interaction between environment and physiology did not create a clear boundary between inside and outside. Instead, it blurred that distinction as external conditions became part of internal experience. Even rest did not interrupt this exchange. Lying still did not reduce exposure, but often increased it, as the body remained in one position while conditions continued to shift. Over time, this meant that the body could not rely on stability. It adapted to variability instead, responding to changes as they occurred rather than preventing them. And within that ongoing adjustment, weather was not something that could be avoided, only something that could be endured in a way that allowed the body to continue within its limits. When exposure could not be avoided, the body did not become stronger in a simple sense, but more responsive within narrow limits. Temperature changes were not distant measurements but direct pressures that required immediate adjustment. In colder conditions, the body conserved heat by reducing circulation to the outer layers, allowing the core to remain more stable, though at the cost of discomfort in the skin and extremities. In warmer conditions, the body released heat through the surface, relying on moisture and airflow to prevent internal temperature from rising too far. These processes did not create protection. They created temporary balance, and that balance could be disrupted at any time by a change in the environment. Without shelter, these shifts occurred more frequently, and the body had to remain in a continuous state of adjustment. There was no stable zone where temperature could be maintained independently of the surroundings. Instead, internal regulation followed external variation, rising and falling with it. Over long periods of human evolution, this pattern shaped behavior. As much as physiology, the body alone could not maintain comfort, so movement and positioning became essential. Turning away from wind, seeking ground that held less moisture, or aligning with the direction of heat from the sun during the day were all ways of extending what the body could manage on its own. Archaeological evidence suggests that early humans repeatedly occupied areas where such adjustments were possible, not because those places eliminated exposure, but because they allowed slightly more control over it. Even so, these conditions remained temporary. As the environment changed, the same location could shift from manageable to difficult within a short time. This meant that the body could not depend on any single place or condition. It had to remain adaptable, ready to respond to changes without delay. The limits of this adaptability were always present. When conditions moved beyond what internal regulation could handle, discomfort increased, and the ability to rest or remain still was reduced. This did not produce a sudden failure, but a gradual pressure that required the body to adjust again. In this way, temperature was not a constant background, but an active force shaping how long the body could remain in one place, how deeply it could rest, and how it moved through the environment. The absence of shelter did not make these processes more efficient. It made them more visible, as the body's limits were reached more often, and through this repeated exposure, the need for separation from the environment began to take form, not as an abstract idea, but as a recognition of how much the body alone had to manage when no barrier existed. Even as the body adjusted, there were clear limits to what it could sustain, and those limits were not fixed but depended on how long the exposure continued and how conditions shifted over time. Cold that could be tolerated briefly could become difficult when it persisted without interruption, especially when combined with moisture from the ground or air. Heat that could be managed through the surface could become overwhelming when airflow slowed or when the body could not move to reduce its exposure. Without shelter, there was no consistent way to interrupt these conditions. The body could only respond within its own capacity, and when that capacity was approached, behavior had to change again. This created a pattern where stability was never assumed. Instead, the body remained in a cycle of adjustment, moving between states that were more or less manageable depending on the environment. Archaeological evidence suggests that early humans did not remain in one place without reason, and the repeated use of certain locations indicates that those places offered conditions that stayed within these limits for longer periods. Slight elevation, natural drainage, or partial barriers could slow the accumulation of moisture or reduce the intensity of wind, allowing the body to maintain balance with less strain. However, these advantages were always relative. They did not remove the influence of the environment, only altered how quickly the body reached its limits. From a biological perspective, This meant that rest itself was constrained by external conditions. The body could not fully disengage from the environment because it needed to remain responsive to changes that might push it beyond what it could regulate internally. This responsiveness did not always take the form of full wakefulness, but it prevented complete separation from the surroundings. Over time, this created a form of awareness that remained active even during rest, shaped by the need to detect shifts before they became too difficult to manage. The absence of shelter made these limits more immediate, bringing the body into direct contact with conditions that could not be moderated. Rather than existing within a controlled space, the body existed within a range of tolerances that were constantly tested. This did not produce a single moment of failure, but a continuous edge where comfort could shift into strain. And within that shifting boundary, the need for a more stable form of separation became increasingly clear, not as a conceptual goal, but as a response to the repeated experience of reaching the limits of what the body alone could sustain. Sleep did not begin by leaving the environment behind, because there was no boundary to cross. When the body settled, the world remained in contact, continuing to press through temperature, sound, and the surface beneath it. This meant that rest was not a separate state, but a continuation of exposure under reduced movement. The ground still carried its weight, the air still moved across the skin, and subtle shifts in the surroundings continued without interruption. In this condition, sleep could not fully detach from what was happening outside the body, because outside and inside were never clearly divided. Even as the body moved towards stillness, it remained responsive, not through conscious attention, but through a system that stayed open to change. Small variations in temperature could alter how deeply the body settled. A shift in wind could create a slight imbalance, requiring a change in posture. The unevenness of the ground could prevent the body from maintaining one position for long, leading to gradual adjustments that interrupted stillness. Over time, these interruptions shaped the structure of rest itself. Sleep was not a continuous, uninterrupted state, but a sequence of partial settling and readjustment, guided by conditions that were never fully stable. Archaeological evidence does not preserve sleep directly, but the environments where early humans rested suggest that these conditions were common. Sites chosen for repeated use often show signs of slight protection from wind or moisture, indicating that even small improvements in environmental stability were important. However, these improvements did not create complete separation. They only reduced the intensity of exposure, allowing the body to remain still for longer periods before needing to adjust again. From a biological perspective, this pattern aligns with how the human body maintains awareness during rest. Certain sensory pathways remain active, especially those related to detecting change, allowing the body to respond when conditions shift beyond what can be ignored. This does not prevent sleep, but it alters its depth and continuity. The body moves between states, never fully disengaging from the environment that continues around it. Over long periods of human history, this form of rest became the norm, not as a disruption, but as the natural way sleep unfolded in the absence of shelter. The environment did not stop when the body rested, and the body could not fully stop in response. Instead, sleep became a condition shaped by ongoing contact, where stillness was always partial and separation from the world remained incomplete. Even when the body found a moment of relative stillness, the environment continued to introduce small changes that prevented rest from becoming stable. Temperature did not remain constant through the night, often shifting gradually in ways that the body could not ignore. A surface that felt manageable at one moment could become colder as time passed, drawing heat away and altering the body's position. Moisture from the ground or air could accumulate slowly, increasing discomfort without a clear point of change, making it difficult for the body to remain still for extended periods. These shifts did not occur suddenly, but they did not stop either, creating a continuous need for adjustment. Sound also played a role, not as a clear signal, but as a pattern of variation. In an open environment, there is no consistent barrier to contain or filter sound, so changes in the surrounding space become more noticeable. A brief movement in the distance, a change in airflow, or the presence of other living organisms could introduce subtle disturbances that the body would register even during rest. These were not necessarily threats, but they represented changes that the body could not fully disregard. The absence of shelter meant that there was no controlled interior where sound could be reduced or stabilized. Instead, the auditory environment remained open, and the body had to remain partially responsive to it. The ground itself contributed to these interruptions. Uneven surfaces prevented the body from maintaining a single position without strain. Over time, pressure would build in certain areas, requiring a shift to relieve it. These movements were small, but they broke the continuity of stillness, creating a pattern where rest was repeatedly adjusted rather than sustained. Archaeological evidence of repeated resting sites suggests that early humans preferred areas where these disruptions were slightly less intense, such as ground that was more even or locations that reduced exposure to wind. However, these conditions never removed the source of interruption entirely, they only delayed it. From a biological perspective, this pattern aligns with a form of sleep that remains sensitive to external change. The body does not fully disengage, but cycles through lighter and deeper states, adjusting as conditions shift. This responsiveness does not prevent rest, but it fragments it, creating a rhythm that is shaped by the environment rather than separated from it. Over long periods, this would have established a baseline where uninterrupted sleep was not expected, and rest was understood as something that occurred within ongoing variation. The absence of shelter did not create a single disruption, but a continuous sequence of small interruptions, each requiring the body to respond, and together shaping a form of sleep that remained closely tied to the changing world around it. When interruptions are continuous rather than occasional, rest does not collapse, but it changes its structure. Instead of a long, uninterrupted descent into stillness, the body moves through shorter cycles, settling and adjusting in response to the environment. These cycles are not defined by fixed intervals, but by the accumulation of small pressures, cold building through contact with the ground, slight shifts in air movement, or subtle changes in sound. Each of these can alter the depth of rest without fully ending it, creating a pattern where the body remains partially engaged even while lying still. Over time, this produces a form of sleep that is layered rather than continuous. The body may enter deeper states briefly, but it returns more frequently to lighter states where responsiveness is maintained. This does not imply constant wakefulness, but a form of rest that never fully separates from the surrounding conditions. Archaeological evidence cannot record sleep directly, but the environments chosen for repeated rest suggest that early humans sought to reduce the frequency of these interruptions, not eliminate them. Slightly more even ground, partial barriers to wind, and locations with more stable conditions would allow the body to remain in deeper states for longer periods, even if only marginally. These small differences could shape how rest unfolded across the night, influencing how often the body had to adjust. From a biological perspective, this pattern aligns with the way the human nervous system remains sensitive to change during rest. Sensory pathways do not fully close, especially those related to detecting variation in the environment. This allows the body to respond before conditions exceed what can be tolerated, but it also prevents complete disengagement. The result is a form of sleep that is distributed across states rather than concentrated in one continuous phase. Over long periods of human history, this would have been the normal structure of rest, not as a limitation, but as an adaptation to conditions where separation from the environment was not possible. The absence of shelter did not prevent sleep, but it shaped it into a pattern that balanced rest with ongoing awareness. This balance did not create a stable interior space within the night, but it allowed the body to remain within its limits while still responding to a world that continued to change around it. And within this pattern, the need for a more stable environment begins to appear not as a sudden solution, but as a gradual shift toward reducing the number of interruptions that the body had to manage on its own. Without shelter, a place could not become something stable. It could be used, but it could not be held. Each location existed only as long as its conditions remained within what the body could manage, and once those conditions changed, the meaning of that place changed with them. This meant that space was never fixed. It was defined by shifting relationships between terrain, weather, and the body's limits. A slight change in wind direction could make an open area more exposed than before. A drop in temperature could turn ground that once felt neutral into a source of discomfort. Even the angle of light at the end of the day could alter how a place was experienced, shaping how long the body could remain there before needing to move. Archaeological evidence suggests that early humans did not occupy a single location continuously without reason. Instead, patterns of movement appear across landscapes, indicating repeated transitions between places that offer different conditions at different times. These movements were not random. They followed the logic of the environment, shifting as resources, weather, and terrain changed. Without constructed shelter, there was no fixed point that remained stable across these variations. Every place was temporary, not because it lacked importance, but because its usefulness depended on factors that could not be controlled. From a biological perspective, this created a relationship with space that was adaptive rather than possessive. The body did not claim a location as permanent, but responded to it as a set of conditions that could be used while they lasted. This required a continuous awareness of how the environment was changing, not in abstract terms, but through direct experience: temperature on the skin, pressure under the body, movement in the air. Even rest was shaped by this temporality. A place suitable for lying down at one moment might require adjustment later as conditions shifted. There was no expectation that a location would remain the same. Instead, stability was something that had to be found again and again, not something that could be maintained. Over long periods of human history, this created a pattern where movement and adjustment were part of everyday existence. The absence of shelter did not simply mean a lack of protection, but a lack of permanence. Space could not be fixed, only approached, used, and left behind as conditions required. And within that pattern, the idea of a place that could remain stable begins to take on significance, not as a given, but as something that did not yet exist, and had to be gradually formed over time. Movement was not a choice between places, but a response to change that could not be stopped. Without shelter, remaining in one location meant accepting every shift in temperature, wind, and ground conditions as they came. And when those shifts exceeded what the body could manage, the only available adjustment was to move. This did not happen in large, dramatic transitions, but in small, continuous decisions shaped by the environment. A slight increase in wind could lead the body to reposition toward a more protected angle of terrain. A gradual cooling of the ground could cause a shift to a drier or less exposed surface. These movements were not directed toward a permanent destination, but toward temporary conditions that were more manageable than the ones just left behind. Archaeological patterns of site use suggest that early humans repeatedly returned to certain areas, but these returns were not fixed in time or duration. They depended on when conditions aligned again in a similar way. This indicates that movement was not random, but structured around environmental cycles that could not be controlled, only followed. From a biological perspective, this created a form of spatial awareness that was dynamic rather than stable. The body did not rely on memory of a place as unchanging, but on recognition of conditions that could reappear in different locations. This meant that the same type of terrain, a slope, a sheltered edge, a dry patch of ground, could serve a similar function even when it was not the same physical location. Over time, this shaped how space was understood, not as fixed points on a landscape, but as patterns of conditions that could be found, used, and left again. Even rest did not interrupt this pattern of movement. The body could settle only as long as the environment allowed it, and when conditions shifted, stillness gave way to adjustment. This created a rhythm where movement and rest were closely linked, each responding to the same external forces. The absence of shelter meant that there was no place where this cycle could be paused. Movement was not an occasional event, but a continuous background process, shaping how long the body could remain in one position and how it transitioned to another. Within this pattern, the idea of a fixed place begins to emerge as something that could reduce the need for constant adjustment, not by removing change entirely, but by slowing it enough for the body to remain still for longer periods without needing to respond. When movement could not be avoided, the landscape itself became the only guide for where the body could pause, and this made every feature of terrain more significant than it would appear in daylight or from a distance. A slight curve in the land, a cluster of stones, a change in soil texture, or a line of vegetation could alter exposure just enough to matter. These differences were not dramatic, but in the absence of shelter, small variations carried weight because there was no larger structure to override them. The body did not seek perfection in a place, only a temporary reduction in strain. A shallow dip in the ground might reduce wind from one direction while increasing exposure from another. A patch of firmer soil might provide more stable support, but hold less warmth. Each location presented a combination of conditions rather than a single advantage, and the body had to interpret these combinations through direct experience. Archaeological evidence shows that early humans often returned to areas where these combinations aligned more consistently, suggesting that certain terrains provided a more balanced set of conditions across different times. However, even in these locations, the balance was never complete. Changes in weather, season, and time of day continue to alter how the same place was experienced. From a biological perspective, this created a reliance on sensitivity rather than certainty. The body did not recognize a place as permanently suitable, but responded to how it felt in the present moment. This meant that perception was grounded in immediate feedback pressure under the body, temperature across the skin, movement in the air rather than in fixed expectations. Over time, this form of awareness shaped how space was navigated, turning the landscape into a series of temporary solutions rather than stable locations. Even rest depended on these subtle features. The ability to remain still for a longer period was linked to how well the terrain reduced exposure, even if only slightly. When that reduction was no longer enough, the body had to adjust again, either by shifting position or by moving to a different location. The absence of shelter meant that the landscape was not a background, but an active participant in how the body experienced each moment. It provided no guarantees, only variations that could be used while they lasted. And within this ongoing interaction, the idea of creating a space that could hold these conditions steady begins to take form, not as an immediate solution, but as a gradual response to the constant need to interpret and adapt to terrain that never fully stabilized. When the body could not create shelter, it began to recognize forms of shelter that already existed in the landscape, not as constructed spaces, but as interruptions in exposure that could be used for a time. These were not complete enclosures, but partial conditions, rock faces that blocked wind from one direction, overhangs that reduced the direct impact of rain, clusters of trees that softened airflow and altered temperature slightly. The value of these places did not come from what they added, but from what they reduced. In an environment where the body was constantly adjusting to external pressure, even a small reduction in exposure could extend how long a person could remain still. Archaeological evidence shows repeated use of such locations, especially areas near rock shelters, cave entrances, and natural barriers, suggesting that early humans recognized these features as more manageable points within the landscape. However, these places did not function as true shelter in the later sense. They did not isolate the body from the environment, but only reshaped how the environment was experienced. Wind could still shift direction, temperature could still change, and the ground remained in direct contact with the body. From a biological perspective, this meant that these natural formations did not remove the need for continuous adjustment, but allowed it to happen at a slower rate. The body could remain within its limits for longer, not because the conditions were stable, but because they changed less abruptly. This created a pattern where certain places were revisited, not out of permanence, but because they consistently offered a slightly more balanced set of conditions. Over time, these repeated returns left patterns in the distribution of artifacts, signs of repeated occupation, and subtle modifications of space through use rather than construction. These traces suggest that the earliest form of shelter was not something built, but something recognized, a way of reading the landscape for interruptions in exposure. Even rest within these spaces remained partial. The body did not fully separate from the environment, but experienced it in a moderated form. The difference was not absolute, but relative, and that difference shaped how long stillness could be maintained before adjustment was required again. Within this process, the relationship between the body and the environment began to shift. Instead of only responding to conditions as they appeared, the body started to anticipate where those conditions might be reduced, using memory of terrain and experience to guide movement. And in that shift, the first step toward creating shelter begins to emerge. Not as a sudden invention, but as a gradual transition from finding protection to understanding how it might eventually be formed. Among the natural features that reduced exposure, rock shelters and cave entrances appear repeatedly in the archaeological record, not as fully enclosed living spaces, but as locations where the relationship between the body and the environment could be slightly altered. These places did not remove the outside world, but they changed its direction and intensity. A rock wall could block wind from one side, creating a zone where air movement slowed and temperature shifted more gradually. An overhang could reduce direct rainfall, allowing the ground beneath to remain drier for longer periods. These changes were modest, but in the absence of constructed shelter they became significant. The evidence for repeated use of such sites suggests that early humans returned to them when conditions aligned, not because they offered complete protection, but because they extended the range within which the body could remain stable. Layers of occupation, traces of fire, and distributions of tools indicate that these locations were used across different times, often in ways that reflect a balance between exposure and access to the surrounding landscape. From a biological perspective, these spaces did not eliminate the need for continuous adjustment, but they reduced the frequency and intensity of environmental pressures. This allowed the body to remain in a more consistent state for longer periods, particularly during rest. However, even within these areas, the environment remained present. Air still moved, temperature still changed, and the ground still transmitted pressure and moisture. The difference was not one of separation, but of modulation. These places acted as partial buffers, shaping how the body experienced the environment without removing it entirely. This partial buffering is reflected in how these sites were organized. Evidence suggests that individuals positioned themselves in relation to the most stable parts of the space, closer to walls or under overhangs where exposure was reduced, while still maintaining access to the open environment beyond. This arrangement indicates an awareness of gradients within space, where some areas offered more stability than others. Over time, this awareness likely influenced how early humans evaluated and selected locations, developing a sensitivity to subtle variations in terrain that could alter exposure. The repeated use of these features suggests that they were not random choices, but part of a consistent pattern shaped by environmental conditions. And within that pattern, the idea of creating similar conditions of shaping space rather than only finding it begins to take form, emerging slowly from the consistent experience of how even partial shelter could change the limits of what the body could endure. When a place was used again and again, it began to carry a different kind of meaning, not as ownership, but as recognition. The landscape did not change into something controlled, yet certain locations became familiar because they consistently offered conditions that remained within the limits of what the body could manage. This repetition is visible in archaeological layers where traces of human presence accumulate over time, suggesting that early humans returned to the same types of environments when they encountered them again. These returns were not fixed in schedule, but guided by the reappearance of similar conditions: dry ground, partial wind protection, access to surrounding resources. The place itself was not permanent, but the pattern of its use was. From a biological perspective, this created a connection between memory and environment that did not depend on stable structures. The body did not remember a place as unchanged, but as a set of conditions that could be recognized when they appeared again. This meant that familiarity was not tied to a single location, but to a type of space that reduced exposure in consistent ways. Over time, this allowed early humans to move through landscapes with a form of anticipation, not knowing exactly what they would find, but recognizing where certain advantages were more likely to exist. Even rest became linked to this pattern. The ability to remain still for longer periods depended on how closely a location matched these previously experienced conditions. When it did, the body could settle more fully. When it did not, rest remained shorter and more fragmented. The repetition of certain sites suggests that these differences mattered enough to influence movement and choice across generations. However, even in these familiar places, the environment was never fully stable. Changes in season, weather, and time of day continued to alter how the same location was experienced. This meant that repetition did not create permanence, only a higher probability of manageable conditions. The absence of shelter kept this relationship dynamic, preventing any place from becoming fully separate from the environment. Instead, the landscape functioned as a network of temporary solutions, connected by patterns of use rather than fixed boundaries. And within this network, the gradual shift from recognizing suitable conditions to attempting to recreate them begins to emerge, not as a single innovation, but as a slow transition shaped by repeated experience and the limits of what the body could sustain without a stable form of protection. Even when the environment could be partially moderated by terrain, the body remained the final limit, and that limit was shaped by how human physiology interacts with exposure over time. Skin could sense change with precision, but it could not prevent it. It allowed heat to move outward and inward, moisture to accumulate or evaporate, and pressure to be transmitted directly into the body. Without shelter, these processes were not buffered by any external layer, making the body itself the primary site where the environment was experienced and managed. The human body does not maintain a fixed internal state independently of its surroundings. It continuously adjusts through mechanisms that conserve heat, release it, or redistribute it depending on conditions. These adjustments are effective within a certain range, but they are not designed to eliminate exposure. Instead, they allow the body to remain functional while conditions fluctuate. When those fluctuations remain moderate, the body can maintain balance with minimal strain. But when they extend beyond what internal regulation can manage, discomfort increases, and the ability to remain still or at rest begins to decline. Archaeological evidence does not record these internal processes directly, but it provides context through the types of environments where human activity is found. The repeated use of locations that reduce wind, retain warmth, or limit moisture suggests that early humans were operating within the constraints of their physiology, selecting spaces that allowed the body to remain within its limits for longer periods. From a biological perspective, this reflects an ongoing interaction between internal regulation and external conditions, where the body is not separate from the environment, but continuously influenced by it. Even small differences in exposure could alter how quickly the body approached its limits, affecting how long a person could remain in one place without needing to adjust. This created a form of awareness that was grounded in physical sensation rather than abstract evaluation, where the body responded to immediate feedback rather than fixed expectations. Over time, this relationship shaped not only how space was used, but how it was understood, linking the concept of place to the capacity of the body to remain within a manageable range of conditions. And within this ongoing interaction, the idea of creating a more stable boundary begins to take form, emerging from the repeated experience of how often the body alone reached the limits of what it could endure. Skin is not a barrier that separates the body from the environment, but a surface where exchange takes place, and in the absence of shelter, that exchange becomes constant and direct. Heat moves across it, moisture forms and dissipates, and every change in air movement alters how these processes unfold. When conditions are cooler, the body reduces blood flow near the surface, allowing internal warmth to be preserved, though this also makes the outer layers more sensitive to further loss. When conditions are warmer, heat is released through the skin, supported by the movement of air that carries it away. These processes do not create stability. They create a shifting balance that depends on what the environment allows at any given moment. Without shelter, this balance is rarely maintained for long. A change in wind can increase heat loss, even if the temperature itself does not drop significantly. A slight increase in humidity can slow the body's ability to release heat, altering how warmth is experienced. The ground beneath the body also plays a role, drawing heat away through direct contact or retaining it depending on its composition. From a biological perspective, this means that the skin is not only sensing the environment, but participating in it, acting as the point where internal regulation meets external variation. Archaeological patterns suggest that early humans selected locations where this exchange could be moderated, not stopped, indicating an awareness of how certain environments influence the body's ability to maintain balance. However, even in these locations, the exchange remained active. The body could not fully isolate itself from these processes, and as a result, it had to remain responsive to subtle changes that could accumulate over time. This responsiveness extended into periods of rest where the body continued to adjust even when movement was reduced. Over long stretches of human history, this continuous exchange shaped how exposure was experienced, not as a single event, but as an ongoing condition where the body remained in direct contact with the forces that acted upon it. And through this constant interaction, the limits of what skin and internal regulation could manage became more apparent, reinforcing the gradual need for a boundary that could interrupt this exchange rather than only respond to it. When exposure continues without interruption, the limits of the body do not appear suddenly, but emerge through accumulation, as small imbalances build over time until they can no longer be managed within the body's normal range. A surface that draws only a small amount of heat at first can, over extended contact, reduce warmth enough to alter how the body functions. Air that feels mild can gradually increase heat loss if it remains constant, especially when combined with stillness. Moisture that forms slowly on the skin or ground can change how temperature is experienced, making conditions more difficult without a clear moment of transition. Without shelter, there is no consistent way to interrupt these processes, so the body remains within them, adjusting continuously while approaching its limits in gradual steps. This creates a condition where strain is not immediate, but develops quietly, requiring the body to respond before discomfort becomes too great. From a biological perspective, this means that tolerance is not a fixed threshold, but a shifting boundary that depends on duration as much as intensity. The longer exposure continues, the narrower the range of manageable conditions becomes, and the more frequently the body must adjust to remain within it. Archaeological evidence suggests that early humans did not remain in one location when these limits were approached, and the movement between sites reflects an awareness of how prolonged exposure influenced the ability to rest and remain stable. Even in environments that offered partial protection, these limits were still present, only delayed rather than removed. The body could maintain balance for longer periods, but eventually required change, either through repositioning or relocation. This pattern indicates that the absence of shelter did not simply create discomfort, but shaped the rhythm of human activity, linking movement, rest, and location to the gradual accumulation of environmental effects. Over time, this would have made the benefits of reducing exposure more apparent, not as a sudden realization, but as a repeated experience of how much the body had to manage on its own. And within that experience, the idea of creating a space that could interrupt this accumulation begins to take form, emerging from the recognition that without such interruption, the body would always remain close to the limits of what it could endure. At a certain point, the pattern of constantly finding better conditions begins to shift towards something more deliberate, where the body no longer only searches for reduced exposure, but starts to influence how that reduction is created. This change does not appear suddenly as a complete structure, but as small adjustments to the immediate environment, placing materials, repositioning objects, or altering the ground in simple ways that affect how air moves, or how the body contacts the surface. These actions do not form shelter in the later sense, but they represent a transition from passive adaptation to active modification. Archaeological evidence suggests that early humans began to organize their immediate surroundings in ways that reflect this shift, such as arranging stones, using vegetation, or maintaining areas that show repeated patterns of use. These traces do not indicate permanent construction, but they suggest an awareness that the environment could be slightly shaped rather than only endured. From a biological perspective, this marks an important change in how the body relates to its limits. Instead of responding only after conditions become difficult, these small modifications begin to delay or reduce the rate at which those limits are reached. A slight barrier to wind, a more even surface for rest, or a drier area maintained through repeated use could extend the period during which the body remains within a manageable range. These changes are modest, but they accumulate in their effect, altering how exposure is experienced over time. Even so, the environment remains present. These early modifications do not remove it, but they begin to introduce the idea that its impact can be influenced. This creates a new layer in the relationship between body and space, where the environment is no longer entirely external, but something that can be partially shaped through repeated interaction. Over long periods, this shift would not replace the need to move or adapt, but it would begin to change how often and how quickly those adjustments were required. The absence of shelter is still the dominant condition, but within it, a different pattern is forming, one where small interventions begin to create moments of reduced exposure that are not entirely dependent on natural features alone. And within those moments, the earliest form of shelter begins to emerge, not as a defined structure, but as a process of gradually shaping space in response to the limits of the body. As small modifications became more consistent, simple forms of shielding began to appear, not as fixed structures, but as temporary arrangements that altered exposure in limited ways. These were not built to last across long periods, but to respond to immediate conditions, branches placed to interrupt wind, vegetation gathered to reduce contact with the ground, or objects positioned to create slight barriers between the body and open space. These actions did not create a complete enclosure, but they introduced the idea that the environment could be adjusted in a directed way. Archaeological traces of such behavior are subtle, often inferred from patterns rather than preserved structures, but they suggest repeated interaction with materials in ways that go beyond simple use. From a biological perspective, even these minimal changes could affect how the body experienced the environment. A thin layer between the body and the ground could reduce the rate of heat loss. A small barrier could change the direction of airflow, allowing the body to retain warmth more effectively. These effects were limited, but they altered the balance enough to extend the period of rest or reduce the need for constant adjustment. The body was still exposed, but not in the same direct way as before. This created a gradual shift in how space was used, where certain locations were not only chosen, but slightly reshaped to maintain more stable conditions. Over time, these practices would have been repeated and refined, not through a single innovation, but through accumulated experience of what reduced strain and what did not. Even so, these arrangements remained temporary. They depended on available materials and could be easily altered or lost as conditions changed. There was no permanent boundary, only a momentary reduction in exposure that had to be recreated again and again. This meant that the relationship between the body and the environment remained dynamic, but now included an additional layer of interaction where small changes could influence larger outcomes. And within this ongoing process, the concept of shelter begins to take clearer form, not as a completed structure, but as a series of repeated actions that gradually shape space into something that can hold conditions more steadily, even if only for a short time. When simple forms of shielding are repeated, they begin to form a pattern that extends beyond a single moment, creating a continuity between different places and times. These actions do not produce a permanent structure, but they establish a way of interacting with space that can be carried from one location to another. A branch placed to reduce wind in one place can be placed again in a different place, not because the locations are the same, but because the condition being addressed is recognized. This creates a form of knowledge that is not tied to a specific site, but to the relationship between materials and exposure. Archaeological evidence suggests that early humans developed consistent ways of arranging their surroundings, reflected in repeated patterns of material use and spatial organization. These patterns indicate that certain methods of reducing exposure were not isolated events, but part of a growing set of practices that could be applied across different environments. From a biological perspective, this repetition changes how the body experiences its limits. Instead of reaching those limits quickly and adjusting afterward, the body begins to encounter conditions that have already been slightly moderated. This does not remove the need for adaptation, but it alters the timing and intensity of it. The body can remain within a manageable range for longer, and rest can occur with fewer interruptions. Over time, this creates a subtle shift in expectation, where the environment is no longer entirely given, but partially shaped through repeated action. Even so, these early forms of shelter remain fragile. They depend on immediate effort and do not persist without maintenance. They can be altered or lost as conditions change, requiring the same actions to be performed again. This reinforces the connection between behavior and environment, where stability is not built once, but recreated continuously. The absence of permanent shelter still defines the broader condition, but within it, a new pattern is forming, one where repeated actions begin to create moments of relative stability that extend beyond a single instance. And within that pattern, the transition toward more structured forms of shelter becomes possible, not as a sudden development, but as the gradual accumulation of practices that increasingly shape space into something that can hold and maintain conditions over time. At a certain stage, the accumulation of repeated actions begins to hold its effect for longer, and the environment is no longer only adjusted in passing, but arranged in ways that remain for a time beyond a single use. This does not yet form a fully enclosed structure, but it creates a space where conditions change more slowly and more predictably. Materials placed to interrupt wind remain in position, surfaces altered for rest maintain their form, and the immediate surroundings begin to reflect a continuity that was not present before. Archaeological evidence suggests the emergence of such spaces through more consistent patterns of material placement and repeated occupation, indicating that certain locations were not only used, but maintained in ways that extended their usefulness. From a biological perspective, this shift begins to change how the body experiences exposure. Instead of responding to constant variation, the body encounters conditions that remain within a narrower range for longer periods, allowing internal regulation to operate with less strain. Temperature fluctuations are reduced, airflow becomes more stable, and the ground provides a more consistent surface for rest. These changes are still limited, but they introduce a form of stability that was previously absent. The body can remain still for longer without needing to adjust, and rest begins to extend into deeper and more continuous states. However, this stability is not absolute. The environment remains present, and external conditions continue to influence what occurs within these early forms of shelter. The difference lies in the delay and reduction of that influence, not its removal. This creates a transitional condition where the body is not fully separated from the environment, but is no longer entirely exposed to it. Over time, this partial separation alters how space is understood. A place can now hold certain conditions with some consistency, creating the beginning of an inside that persists, even if only for a limited duration. This does not eliminate the need for movement or adaptation, but it changes their frequency and intensity. The body is given more time within a stable range before adjustment becomes necessary, and within this emerging stability, the concept of shelter begins to take clearer form, not as a complete solution, but as a space where the relationship between body and environment is no longer immediate, but mediated through a layer that can be shaped and maintained over time. As this early form of shelter begins to hold its shape for longer periods, one of its most noticeable effects appears in how the body is able to rest, not by removing the environment entirely, but by reducing the number of changes the body must respond to while remaining still. Air no longer moves freely across the body in all directions, but is partially redirected, allowing temperature to shift more gradually. The ground, when altered or covered, transmits less direct pressure and moisture, creating a surface that remains more consistent over time. These changes do not create comfort in the modern sense, but they extend the duration in which the body can remain within its limits without needing to adjust. From a biological perspective, this alters the structure of rest. Instead of being repeatedly interrupted by small variations, the body is able to settle for longer intervals, moving more slowly between states of responsiveness and stillness. This does not eliminate the need for awareness, but it reduces the frequency with which the body must return to it. Archaeological evidence suggests that locations showing signs of early shelter use also show patterns consistent with longer occupation periods, indicating that these spaces allowed for extended rest and reduced movement. The effect is cumulative rather than immediate. Each reduction in exposure adds to the body's ability to remain stable, and over time, these small changes create a noticeable difference in how rest is experienced. Even so, the environment remains present, influencing conditions from beyond the shelter's partial boundaries. The body continues to respond, but with less urgency and less frequency. This creates a new rhythm where rest is no longer defined by constant interruption, but by longer stretches of relative stability, shaped by the presence of a space that can hold conditions steady for a time. Within this shift, the meaning of space begins to change. A location is no longer only a temporary solution, but something that can support the body in a more sustained way. And through this sustained support, the idea of remaining in one place for longer periods becomes more possible not as a fixed decision, but as a result of conditions that no longer require continuous adjustment. As the effects of shelter extend beyond a single moment, the way space is perceived begins to change in a more fundamental way, not only in how the body responds, but in how the environment is understood. A space that can hold conditions for longer periods starts to feel different, not because it is completely separate from the outside, but because it introduces a delay between external change and internal experience. Wind may still move beyond it, temperature may still shift across the wider landscape, but inside this partially shaped space, those changes arrive more slowly and with less intensity. From a biological perspective, this delay alters how the body organizes its responses. Instead of reacting immediately to every variation, it can remain within a narrower range of conditions, allowing internal processes to stabilize for longer periods. This creates a form of continuity that was not previously available, where the body is not constantly adjusting, but maintaining a state that can persist beyond short intervals. Archaeological evidence suggests that as these spaces became more consistently used and maintained, their internal conditions began to show patterns distinct from the surrounding environment, indicating that they were not only occupied, but functioned as zones with their own characteristics. This marks an important shift in the relationship between body and space. The environment is no longer experienced as a continuous surface of exposure, but as something that can be divided, even if only partially, into areas that behave differently. The concept of an inside begins to take form, not as a complete separation, but as a relative condition where change is slowed and moderated. This does not remove the influence of the outside world, but it reshapes it, allowing the body to experience time and change differently within that space. Over time, this altered perception of space would influence how humans relate to their surroundings, making it possible to think of certain areas as more stable, more predictable, and more suitable for extended presence. The absence of shelter once meant that every place was defined by immediate exposure, but with the gradual emergence of these spaces, the environment begins to include zones where conditions can be held, even if only temporarily, and within this shift, the foundation is laid for a new relationship with space, where the body is no longer fully merged with the environment, but begins to exist within spaces that can mediate that connection in a more controlled and sustained way. Even in environments where shelter is constant and reliable, traces of a much older condition remain, shaping how the body responds to space in ways that are often subtle and easily overlooked. The presence of walls and a roof creates a stable interior, but the human body does not fully treat that stability as absolute. It continues to register changes in air, temperature, and sound, even when those changes are minimal. This suggests that the relationship between the body and its surroundings was formed over long periods of direct exposure, and that this history has not been replaced, only layered beneath modern conditions. When the boundary between inside and outside is briefly reduced, such as when stepping into open space, the body adjusts quickly, becoming more attentive to shifts that might not have been noticed within a more controlled environment. This adjustment is not a reaction to immediate danger, but a continuation of a system that remains sensitive to variation in the absence of stable separation. From a biological perspective, this reflects how the human sensory system processes space, maintaining a readiness to respond when conditions become less predictable. Archaeological evidence provides the broader context for this persistence, showing that for most of human history, stable shelter was not consistently available, and exposure was a defining condition of daily life. The patterns of movement, rest, and spatial use that developed under those conditions shaped the structure of perception itself, creating a system that does not fully disengage even when stability is present. This can be observed in how people continue to prefer certain environments over others, often gravitating towards spaces that feel enclosed, balanced, and protected, even when no immediate reason requires it. These preferences are not learned in a short time, but reflect a long history of adaptation to environments where such conditions were rare and valuable. The body recognizes the difference between open exposure and moderated space, even if that recognition is not consciously expressed. Over time, this creates a layered experience of space, where modern shelter provides a level of stability that the body did not originally evolve with, yet the underlying responsiveness remains. The absence of shelter once required continuous adjustment, and while that requirement has been reduced, the system that supports it continues to operate. And within that persistence, the connection between past conditions and present experience becomes visible, not as a memory, but as a pattern of response that remains active beneath the surface of everyday life. When a space provides even a modest boundary, the body responds by settling in a different way, not because all external influence has been removed, but because the rate of change has been reduced enough to allow internal processes to stabilize. A wall does not stop air completely, and a roof does not eliminate temperature variation, yet both introduce a delay between external conditions and what the body experiences. This delay is enough to alter posture, breathing, and the distribution of attention. Instead of remaining broadly responsive to every direction, awareness begins to narrow toward a smaller, more predictable field. The body is not required to track as many variables at once, and this reduction allows it to release some of the continuous adjustment that characterized earlier conditions. From a biological perspective, this shift can be understood as a change in how sensory input is organized. When variation is reduced, the nervous system can move towards states that favor rest, allowing cycles of stillness to extend without frequent interruption. Archaeological patterns show that as more stable forms of shelter became common, occupation sites began to reflect longer periods of use, suggesting that these spaces supported extended presence rather than constant movement. The effect is not only physical but perceptual. A space that holds its conditions begins to feel distinct from the surrounding environment, even if the difference is partial. This distinction supports a sense of orientation, where the body recognizes a consistent interior and adjusts its behavior accordingly. Over time, this creates an association between bounded space and reduced demand on the body's regulatory systems. The experience of being within such a space is not defined by complete isolation, but by the absence of continuous, unpredictable change. Even small features such as a barrier that reduces airflow or a surface that remains dry contribute to this effect, allowing the body to maintain a more stable state. In modern environments, this response persists as the body continues to favor conditions where variation is limited and boundaries are present. This preference does not arise from immediate necessity, but from a long history in which such conditions were rare and beneficial. The absence of shelter once required the body to remain open to constant change, but the presence of shelter introduces a different pattern, where the body can remain within a narrower range of conditions for longer periods, and within that pattern, the sense of stability that shelter provides becomes not only a physical condition, but a fundamental aspect of how space is experienced and understood. Shelter does not only change the conditions around the body, it changes the meaning of space itself, introducing a form of separation that allows the environment to be experienced in layers rather than as a single continuous field. When a boundary can hold for a time, even if imperfectly, the body begins to distinguish between what is immediate and what is distant, between what must be responded to and what can remain outside awareness. This distinction does not remove the environment, but it reorganizes how it is processed, allowing the body to remain within a more stable range while the outside continues to change. From a biological perspective, this creates a shift in how attention is distributed, reducing the need for constant monitoring and allowing internal processes to settle into longer, more continuous patterns. Archaeological evidence reflects this change through the emergence of spaces that show repeated use and increasing organization, suggesting that shelter was not only used, but integrated into how life was structured over time. These spaces begin to function not just as places to reduce exposure, but as locations where activity, rest, and continuity can be maintained with greater consistency. Over long periods, this alters the relationship between movement and stability, making it possible for the body to remain in one place without being driven to adjust as frequently. The absence of shelter once meant that every condition had to be managed directly, with no lasting interruption, but the presence of shelter introduces a different rhythm, where change can be delayed and experienced in a moderated form. This does not eliminate uncertainty, but it reduces its immediacy, allowing the body to operate within a narrower range of variation. In the modern world, this layered experience of space remains, even when shelter is constant and highly controlled. The body continues to recognize the difference between bounded and unbounded environments, adjusting its responses accordingly. This suggests that shelter is not only a physical structure, but a fundamental shift in how humans relate to the world, creating the possibility of distance, stability, and continuity within an environment that was once experienced as entirely immediate. And yet, beneath this stability, the older pattern remains, quietly present, reminding us that the sense of being protected is not something the body began with, but something it gradually learned to create, and that without it, the world would return to being something that is not held at a distance, but directly felt in every moment.